In the last section, we installed Enzyme into our project, which is going to allow us to do a little bit of a refactor to this test right here and make it work just a little bit more nicely. We're going to first get started with a quick discussion of how we make use of Enzyme. We'll then take a look at some documentation and then do our actual refactor. So first, how do we really make use of Enzyme? Well, at a top level, Enzyme really gives us 3 additional capabilities for writing our tests. You'll notice that back over here, inside of our test file right now, we created a div, then we rendered our app component into that div, and then that gave us access to that kind of magic div that we could interact with and inspect and write a expectation around it. So when we make use of Enzyme, we skip that entire process where we render our component into a div after creating the div. Instead, we're going to be making use of 3 general methods for creating instances of our components and then writing expectations around them. So the 3 ways in which we're going to be interacting with Enzyme is by using a static renderer, a shallow renderer, and a full DOM renderer. So each of these different render functions are essentially going to take an instance of our components. It's going to kind of treat them or attempt to render them in a slightly different fashion, and then it will return back to us an object that we can use to write our tests around. So let's very quickly talk about the 3 different ways. First off is the static renderer. So this is a function that we can pass a component to. When we pass a component to static, it's going to take our component, it'll render the component, take all the HTML that's generated, and then return to us an object that just contains that HTML. The key thing here is that we don't have any ability to interact with that HTML that's generated. We can't simulate clicking on something or entering any text. It's really just static HTML that allows us to make an assertion about the HTML that was generated. Next up is the shallow renderer. The shallow renderer takes a component and renders just that component and none of its children. So a good example of this might be the app component that we're working on. If we use this shallow render on the app component that we just created, and let's really quickly pull up our app component right here. So if we rendered our app component, we would essentially just get back a div with kind of a placeholder that says, hey, a comment box should exist here, but it doesn't really. So the shallow render is used when we want to test one component by itself in isolation and not try to make any assertions about the components underneath it. Finally, the full DOM render. This takes an instance of a component, renders that component and all of its children. It then returns an object back to us that we can use to kind of interact with that component. So we can simulate click events or entering text or otherwise interacting with that component. We can use this full DOM rendering functionality to essentially render out a full copy of our entire application and then somehow test interactions with the entire app. So we're going to eventually touch on all 3 of these, maybe not quite so much the static one, but we're definitely going to make use of shallow and full DOM for the purposes of testing our application. So now that we've spoken a little bit about shallow and full DOM and static, let's very quickly go and look at some documentation around this shallow render, and we'll get a better sense of how we are going to use it to solve the current problem that we have right now, which is writing a test and making sure that the comment box exists inside the app component. So I'm going to quickly pull up the documentation for Enzyme. If you want to follow along, you can find the documentation at airbnb.io/enzyme. So I'm going to pull up my browser and navigate to airbnb.io/enzyme. And once here, on the left-hand side, I'm going to scroll down a little bit until I find the shallow rendering section. And then underneath that, I'll find the function of find right here. So I'll click on find, and then I will look at the documentation here. I'll zoom in or scroll down just a little bit more, and I'll find the section of component constructors. So this is an example of exactly what you and I are trying to do right now. You'll see that in this example, they are trying to make a test or write an expectation around the component called myComponent. There is another component inside this application called foo, and they want to write a test to make sure that an instance of the foo component exists inside of myComponent. So they render that my component using that shallow render that we just spoke about. And then they look inside of that rendered component and look to see if there's an instance of the foo component in there. And more specifically, they write a test to say there's exactly one instance of foo inside. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that the matcher that you see right here of to.have.length dot, or excuse me, well, no dot at the end, but you get the idea. This is a matcher that you would find with Mocha or Chai. So we're going to write a slightly different expectation since we're working with Jest, but the overall idea here is the same. We want to render an instance of our app component with that shallow renderer, and then we're going to look at it and make sure that it has a single copy of the comment box component inside of it. So, at long last, that is how we're going to tackle this issue. That's how we are going to attempt to look inside of our app component and make sure that it has an instance of the comment box without actually knowing about any of the implementation details of the comment box component itself. So let's take one more quick break. We're going to come back in the next section and implement that test into this test file. So I'll see you in just a minute.